To make food using photosynthesis and using the chlorophyll that's in the leaves. So in order to have a strong, healthy plant that can do that, they need other nutrients, trace nutrients that they get from within the soil. They need about 17 different minerals and nutrients, but there's only 3 that are the major ones that we're going to talk about today. And those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And you can see them illustrated here on this poster that Delia made. So nitrogen is an ingredient in chlorophyll, and it is what produces green leafy growth and strong stems. So it's a really important one for plants, and it's what they use up the quickest typically. Phosphorus is needed for developing fruit, flowers, and root systems. And then potassium keeps roots healthy and also aids in flower and fruit production. And it helps plants tolerate stress and drought. And then there's also trace minerals like calcium, zinc, copper, boron, chlorine, iron, and a bunch of other trace minerals that plants need. So looking at this poster, nitrogen, it's found in things like compost and waste materials from animals. So like blood meal, feather meal. There's a lot of byproducts in the food industry. So if you're processing, say, chickens or something like that, you're going to pluck out the feathers, and that's used to make some fertilizers, or the blood meal is used to make fertilizer. So there's a lot of different byproducts that are used that go back into the industry to make fertilizers. It's kind of a weird, gross process sometimes. And then phosphorus is used for flowers and fruit production. And that comes from things like rocks and bones. And then potassium helps with fruit and flowers, and that comes from wood ash. That's a big place that comes from. And then also minerals and rocks powders. You can also get that from banana peels, which I use in my compost for potassium. So those 3 together, NPK is how they're illustrated, and on fertilizer bags, it's represented as 3 numbers. And so depending on the kind of plant you're growing, their nutrient needs are different. Some plants need a lot of nitrogen. Some plants, like if you're growing potatoes, that's all a root. What you eat is a root, so you're going to want to fertilize it with something that's good for the roots. So it's a little bit of a strategy involved in figuring out what plants need to eat. As we talked about in urban environments, like living in cities and growing things in cities, the soil isn't the same as it would be in like a forest or in the middle of, the country or something like that. The ground is hard. Usually the ecosystem is not like a natural ecosystem. We put plants in that don't naturally grow here a lot of times. And even in the garden, we're growing things that aren't naturally grown in this space. So the soil kind of is not a natural soil. So one thing we can do to help build the soil is kind of replicate a healthy and natural ecosystem. And a lot of people that grow food, they'll just use fertilizer, but there's other ways that we can build the soil and provide all these nutrients for plants that don't require buying something or using these byproducts. We could just use compost or say hay or animal manures or things like that. So we can use things that are free, essentially. One thing I like to do is make my own compost, because you're not only feeding the plants, you're feeding the soil, which will feed more plants later. It's just building a healthy ecosystem so that all plants can thrive. So there's a couple ways you can make compost. You could also plant cover crops or plant something that's feeding the soil, but making compost is a really easy thing you can do. It's something you can do even if you don't have an outdoor space. I used to live in a tiny apartment in New York City, and I made compost under my sink. And I just used food scraps. So say a banana peel or coffee grounds or something like that. You can throw them in a bucket and get some worms, and you can start making compost. Worms are really great composters. They are constantly eating and constantly breaking things down, and what they poop out is essentially nutrients for your soil. So this is worm poop, and this is one of the most nutritious things you can give to your plants. In this box, I took a chunk of my worm bin. As you can see, there's little worms in here, and they're actively making nutrients for plants right now. And when this is finished, when it all looks like dirt, I'll dry it out and give it to my plants. And it's pretty awesome. We can dig through this in a little bit and look for the different kinds of critters that are in here building the soil. It smells like coffee. So like I said, making living compost, making something that's alive to give your plants is not only helping your plants, but it's building the soil. And when you build the soil, the plants in the soil can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere. They can pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's kind of creating a living ecosystem that's self-sufficient. So we don't have to constantly be putting additives into it. One of the big problems with industrialized agriculture, which is pretty much how we get all of our food, is that they're constantly using things from the soil and not adding anything back that's creating healthy soil. So say if someone's growing a field of broccoli, they're using all of the nitrogen and using all of the phosphorus in the soil and never adding anything back to build the soil. So they're creating like a dead soil that's not helpful for the environment. And then they have to spend a lot of money to feed their plants with byproducts or chemicals or things like that. So it's a really unhealthy system, and lots of people are starting to do something about it. So it's pretty positive. So let's see. Today we're gonna explore two different kinds of compost. We're gonna make compost tea outside, and basically that is just like how you'd make normal tea. You chop up something, some kind of a plant, and make a tea bag out of it and steep it in water, and then after some time you get tea. And the way you make compost tea is you use a plant that has a lot of nitrogen in it, chop it up, steep it in water, and in about 10 days you have this really nutritious liquid that you can water plants with. So we're going to make some of that outside today. Not every leaf you can make tea with. There's only certain kinds, but I'll point some out in the garden when we go out there. Let's see. And then we're also going to talk a little bit more about worm compost. And one of the resources in your textbook is links on how to build that at home. You can build it out of pretty much any kind of container that you have. You just need to drill some holes in it so that they get air. And you're basically layering food scraps, brown paper or newspaper or scrap paper, and the worms do the rest. It's very easy, and it's a great way to use up the waste that we produce to make something awesome. Not all worms are the same. The kind we use for vermicompost are red wiggler worms. They're pretty easy to find, but they are really, really hard workers. And so they're kind of the ideal ones to use. And they don't try to leave all the time. Like some other worms, they try to dig their way and go somewhere else. So there's lots of other ways you can make compost. You can just make a pile of food scraps or plant scraps, and over time it'll break down. But this is kind of one of the quicker ways, and it's nice and neat. So you can have it in your home and then it doesn't create smells or attract bugs or rats or anything like that. Finally, our plants need water to survive. Water is a precious resource. It's actually a finite resource. We don't have unlimited amounts of water. Although it comes down in the form of rain, not all water is clean. Most of the water on our planet is salt water. So fresh, clean, non-salted water is a finite resource. And it's tough to get in a lot of places in the world. So we want to be really water wise when we water our plants and not waste any. So we're going to learn ways to optimize watering, especially when we're outside. So seeds and seedlings, they like to have moist soil when seeds are first planted. So usually I like to water the soil at first so that the damp soil can surround the seed and start the process of getting it to grow, because it needs to be in contact with water in order to start growing. Once they start growing, once they're about this size, you can see the first leaves that come are called the cotyledons. Those are the baby leaves. And then the second leaves that come are their true leaves. So most plants kind of look the same when they have their first cotyledon leaves, but once they have their true leaves, you can really tell what they are. And we also labeled these, so you can tell that these are cucumbers. But you can see their true leaves are coming, so now is a good time to start fertilizing and also to shift the way we water. So we're going to let the soil dry out slightly before we water again. And when we water things in pots like this, we're going to do it really slowly and really carefully. We're going to make sure there's not standing water in the bottom. We're going to water just enough so that it moistens the soil, and actually if there's any water in the bottom, it'll start to soak it up, but we don't want to just leave standing water all the time. So just enough to keep it moist. When you start to see the soil pulling away from the sides, that's a good sign that it's ready to be watered. So with trays like this, I like to use a spray bottle, but we can also use a little watering can. And we just want to make sure we're doing it very slowly and carefully so we're not disturbing the root system. Let me grab one of these watering cans. So I'm just going to show you a little bit. So just really slowly and carefully, a little bit at a time, letting it soak in, and then we can get a sense of whether it needs more or if it seems like it's nice and damp. So when we're outside, the same kind of ideas apply. We want to water really slowly. We want to water the soil and not the leaves. The leaves actually don't take water in. The roots do. So we want to water only the soil and let it soak in. If the soil outside is really dry, sometimes the water will just run away. So watering really slowly helps with the uptake. So yeah, we want to limit the amount of runoff. And the more we just water really slowly, it'll soak in, and then it'll be more receptive to more water. Use tools. So we use a sprinkler to mimic the way that rain falls. We can use trays under potted plants to capture extra water and allow it to soak in slowly. We can use a rain nozzle on our hose to mimic rain and let it kind of penetrate the soil more evenly. We also want to water deeply. So you can see here how deep the roots go. So if we're only watering this top little portion of the soil, these roots aren't getting any water down here. So we want to water in a way that we're just adding a little bit at a time, and it's going deeply into the soil and getting all those roots, and then we'll add a little more. So it's a very patient process, And if you don't have patience, then use a tool, use a sprinkler or something like that, where you can set it up and then walk away and come back later. But we want the plant's roots to take up as much as possible. So we're going to kind of use our imaginations to think about where the roots are, how big they go, and where the water will soak in the best. If we look at trees, where the leaves go to is called the drip line. So trees' roots go all the way out to the edge of their leaves. So when you're watering a tree, it's a really big span of space. It's not just the trunk. It's like the whole outside. And most plants are the same way. The extent of the leaves is where their roots are going. So you can kind of think about that as we're watering, like where the roots are and where it'll take up the water the best. Soil that's shaded is also better to water because when the soil sits out in the sun, it becomes hydrophobic. It actually acts like a rock, and when you water it, the water just runs off. So whereas soil is shaded, it usually is a little more receptive to water. And like I said, water is a finite resource, so we want to be really careful with how we're watering and not waste it and not leave hoses on and not be spraying things that don't need water. So we'll be really wise and thoughtful on how we're using our water. Let's see. So we're going to talk a little bit about transplanting over the weeks, but so as these are getting bigger, as they're getting their true leaves, we're going to kind of want to separate these plants so that as we're watering, the roots are filling up as much space as they can and not becoming entangled with each other. So that's one thing we can do possibly today if we have time, is do a little transplanting so that each of these plants is getting all the water they can from the cells. Yeah. So that was very short, but one thing about the soil is we want it to feel like a damp sponge. We don't want it to feel soggy or too dry. So if you think about like a damp sponge on the side of your sink, that's how the soil should feel. This feels pretty good to me. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
You want to talk about the sprouts?
Oh yeah, so last week, I'm not sure if any of you were here last week, but we made some sprouts using beans. So this is one way that you can grow healthy and nutritious food without even having a garden. You can do it right on your countertop. These are mung bean sprouts, so I soaked them in water last week when we were here. And then every day I've given them a rinse of water. I actually use the extra water from rinsing it to water my indoor plants, so I wasn't wasting any. And then after a week, these are all sprouts that I can put on my food. And sprouts have a lot of nutrition in them because it's like the smallest version of the plant, and these seeds have the most nutrients in them. So this is like a little powerhouse of nutrients that I can put on my food and have some fresh greens to eat if I would like. Does anyone want to try any? So they look a little funky because when they're made in a jar, I have to shake them and it kind of like bruises them a little bit, but they taste okay. Do you want to pass those around?
Mm-hmm.
They look funky. So has anyone ever made compost before? Any interest in it? Yeah? What kind did you make?
It was from my garden, from my fruits and vegetables, and we do stew the tumbler.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Cool.
So it wasn't like, I don't know, just a
Kitchen scraps?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's a good way to go. I have a tumbler at home too. That makes it really quick. So the more heat you have in your compost, and the more, it's called greens and browns. So we'll talk a little bit about this, things that can go in compost. But you want to have a balance of grains and browns and heat and water, and that's how you make compost essentially. So browns are things like dry leaves, wood chips, shredded paper, sawdust or wood shavings, any kind of cardboard, as long as it doesn't have print, like colored prints on it, straw or hay, toilet paper tubes, things like that. And then the green materials are fruit and veggie scraps. Most work, I don't put citrus, and I don't put onion, and I don't put meat scraps in my compost. That's how you can attract rodents, and also it kind of makes the compost too acidic if you use citrus. So pretty much any other vegetable scraps. I also don't put things like avocado pits or things that are too hard to break down. Coffee grounds and the filter paper, tea bags, feathers, eggshells, grass and plant clippings, weeds. I put a lot of different kinds of weeds. I don't put weeds that have seeds because then you're kind of just planting the seeds again. So I'm pretty careful about that, but you can put them in if you wanted to. And the key is to put an even amount of each, and then also to turn it in some way. So in my vermicompost, every time I put something new in, I stir it a little bit. In my home compost, like Luke said, you can use a tumbler, or you can just kind of use a shovel and flip it over every once in a while. But you're essentially adding air to it, and that's helping with breaking things down. And if you have a good, healthy compost, you're getting some critters in there that are helping do the work for you too. So there's worms, and then there's also a lot of other little bugs that are actively building compost. So you guys have probably seen these little roly-poly pill bugs before, right? Those guys are really busy composters. They pretty much exclusively eat dead things and turn it into soil. These are called earwigs. They're kind of gross, and they're really good composters as well. Ants are always making compost, and also centipedes. There's also tiny little microbes and bacteria that come in. If we looked at this under a microscope, there'd be like millions of little critters in there actively making compost. So it's not just the things you can see, it's a lot of other little microscopic things as well. And this is where the life is. So this is where we're creating an ecosystem to, bless you, to, it's kind of a food web that we're creating, a soil food web. So by doing that, we're giving life to the roots of our plants and helping them to thrive. So creating an ecosystem wherever possible is the key. Does anyone want to check out some worms? Yeah? All right. Do you want to take this around? So feel free to dig through, and here, actually take this too, and see if you can find any other of those critters in there. So it's really important that we are providing the nutrition our plants need for different phases. These plants look awesome, but they're missing something. Does anyone have any ideas of what they're missing? I would say they're missing sun. This is called being leggy. They don't have enough sun to build strong, healthy roots, stems. And so they're just reaching up towards the sky to try to find the sun, but it's not enough to create a strong, healthy plant. This one seems to be okay, but it needs something to climb on and also some sun. So I think we should take this one out and put it in the garden and see how much quicker it grows when it's given actual sunlight. These ones I think are a lost cause. They're just too leggy. They're not going to create strong, healthy plants. So like I said before with the true leaves, once they get the true leaves, that's when we want to start fertilizing or paying attention to some of these other trace mineral or light needs. These plants, in my opinion, are ready to go outside, ready to go in the ground, or into a bigger pot so that they can develop bigger root systems and get stronger. And as soon as we do that, and as soon as we fertilize them, you'll see them just explode. and get much bigger. So I think we should transplant those and fertilize them and see what happens before next week. So some of the other ways we can feed our soils outside especially is by planting cover crops, planting things that are feeding the soil when we're not actively growing food. In the fall, I like to put straw or manure or something to cover the soil and protect it from rain and from snow. And then what that does is it creates a shelter for worms and other bugs to live under. So you're kind of inviting things to come and live in the soil and be actively building it while it's resting in the off seasons. You could also do that with cardboard, which is free. Most places throw away tons of cardboard, and if you collect it and make sheets of cardboard, it's called sheet mulching. The cardboard breaks down over the winter, and then in the springtime, there's all these nutrients that have come to the surface because of bugs and worms and different things under the cardboard, and then it's ready to plant and provide nutrients for your new garden. So there's lots of ways we can build soil for free. There's so many resources in an urban environment. So all it takes is a little creativity and some time. All right. That's pretty much all I have here. Should we go out into the garden and do some fun things out there? All right. Luke's ready.
So
Sheet mulching?
Yeah, so I can put it.